Imagine the entire world had only one petrol pump. Every country needs fuel to run its economy. Cars, shipping, planes, everything depends on energy. But there is one rule. This petrol pump only accepts one currency. And so if you want fuel, you must first get that currency. Now imagine the country who owns that currency also gets to decide who is allowed at the petrol pump. That, in very simple terms, is how the global financial system works. And it all connects to something called the petrodollar. And to understand the existence and the origin of petrodollar, we need to go back to World War II. And so, welcome back to another episode of Bridging Perspectives with Dania Rana, where today we will be talking about the origin of petrodollar and how it links to the US-Israel-Iran war happening right now. The moment the global financial system was designed. In July 1944, when the World War II was still ongoing, representatives from 44 allied nations gathered together in a small town in the United States called Bretton Woods. Their goal was simple but historic. They wanted to design a new global economic system that would prevent the financial chaos that had led to the Great Depression and the war. During this conference, two major global institutions were created: the International Monetary Fund, which we call the IMF, and the World Bank. These institutions were meant to stabilize economies and help rebuild countries that were affected during the war. But the most important question discussed at Bretton Woods was, which country should the world rely on for international trade and finance? And in that moment in history, the answer was pretty obvious: US dollars. Why the dollar became the center of the system. At the end of World War II, the US was in a financially powerful position. The US held about 68% of the world's gold reserves. Because of this massive gold reserve that the US had, a rule was created at Bretton Woods. All major global currencies would be linked to the US dollar, and the US dollar itself would be linked to gold. The fixed rule was pretty simple. $35 would equal to an ounce of gold. This meant that any country holding US dollars could exchange those dollars for gold from the US. And because the dollar was backed by gold, countries trusted it. And this is how the United States became the central currency for the global financial system. The problem that appeared in the 1960s. For the first couple of decades, this system was running perfectly fine. But over time, a problem began to appear. The United States started spending large amounts of money on wars, trade, and financial institutions. And as the US government spent more, it also printed more dollars. But there was one issue. To meet the global demand, the US was printing more dollars than the amount of gold reserve they had, which eventually caused inflation. And this created pressure on the US gold reserves. The shock of 1971. In 1971, this situation reached a breaking point. The then US President Richard Nixon made a historic decision. He announced that the US government will not be converting dollars into gold anymore. In other words, the rule that $35 was equal to 1 ounce of gold was no longer there. This decision became known as the Nixon Shock. And so this creates a question. If the dollar was no longer backed by gold, why would countries be using it? The birth of the petrodollar. And so this question led to a new strategy. During the 1970s, the US developed close agreements with major Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia. The United States would provide security and military protection. In return, these oil-producing countries would sell their oil, but in the US dollars. This meant that if any country wanted to buy their oil, it had to first obtain US dollars. And since oil powers the global economy, the need and demand for the US dollars remained strong. This entire system became known as the petrodollar system. How petrodollar flowed back to the United States. There was another important element to this entire arrangement. The money earned by oil-producing countries selling oil, especially Saudi Arabia, did not simply sit in bank accounts. Much of it was reinvested back into the United States. This included investments in US Treasury bonds, American infrastructure, financial markets, and major corporations. And this process is often called the petrodollar recycling, because countries sell oil in the US dollars, and then those US dollars are reinvested back into the United States into these four ways. And so this strengthened the dollar even further. Why this system created global influence? Because oil is traded in dollars, countries around the world constantly needed US dollars. Central banks hold large dollar reserves. International banks conduct many transactions in dollars. Global trade often passes through dollar-based financial systems. This gives the United States significant financial power over all the other countries. Not because it controls every economy directly, but because the global system itself is deeply connected to the dollar. Why the system is being challenged today? In recent years, some countries have started questioning this global financial system. Several countries have explored trading in other currencies. China has promoted the use of Chinese yuan. Groups like BRICS have discussed creating financial systems that rely less on the US dollar. These efforts are still developing, but they definitely show that the global financial order is still revolving. How does the US, Israel, and Iran conflict connect to the petrodollar? And so, from World War II to 1960s to the 1970s, fast forward today, the tensions we see between United States, Israel, and Iran in the Middle East are not only about military power or security, they are also connected to energy routes and the global financial system. One of the most critical locations in this entire story is the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway sits between Iran and the Gulf states, and it allows the 20% of the world's oil to pass through it. This means whoever gets hold of this energy choke point holds enormous leverage over the global energy markets. And in this US-Israel-Iran war, Iran has claimed that they will allow any ship passing through the Strait of Hormuz if they are trading in Chinese yuan and not US dollars. Now imagine if this shift took place on a larger scale. All countries would be using Chinese yuan instead of US dollars. And so if countries start using this system, it would actually challenge the entire petrodollar system that has dominated global markets up until today. So the tension we see in this region is not only about borders or missiles, it's about something deeper. Who controls the currency used to trade the world's most important resource, energy? Because when energy routes, financial systems, and geopolitical rivalries intersect, the consequences can reshape the balance of global power. And so with that, we conclude today's episode talking about petrodollar and its origin and how it might possibly be challenged in today's war. Because in today's world, power is not only about military strength. Sometimes the greater power lies in the currency the world depends on. And for decades, that currency has been US dollar.